Welcome to the Petty Details of Auto Claims. I'm Jen, and with me is Justin on one side of me. Today, we are doing another diminished value topic, and that topic would be the infamous 17C formula. So, Justin, go ahead and tell us all about the 17C formula and how to argue against that.
Well, 17C, man, I tell you what, sometimes you won't even know the insurance company is using that. But let me tell you a little bit about how I became familiar with 17C. It's because before that, 17C originated in 2001, just so everybody knows. But in 1998, I was working claims and I got a claim that involved diminished value. And it was from an attorney and it was demanding diminished value. So I got to investigating that, and that led into me researching it. And I talked to numerous different attorneys and consulted with some at various different insurance companies. And when in 2001 there was a class action lawsuit in Georgia about diminished value. And so I was really interested in that because it wasn't, people were not pursuing it back in 1998. Not very many
Yeah,
people
it's the
knew.
new topic.
Yeah, and I had been paying attention to it since '98 because it interested me. I was like, "What in the heck, is this?" And I started researching heavy. But all that being said, then in 2001, this case in Georgia, State Farm versus Mabry, was a class action lawsuit, and basically it was first party. All right, meaning that it was their own insurance company that they were going after the diminished value for, and that's not normal. Most of the states are opposite of that. You can get it when it's somebody else's fault, but if you hit a tree on your own, you don't get diminished value because your policy has a limit of liability. So I got to give you a little background to this 17C before we delve into it a little bit deeper. And so
Got it.
then in Georgia, though, if you hit a tree, you can get diminished value from your insurance company. And so that's because of this State Farm versus Mabry case. And during that case, it was, hotly debated at trial and everything, and no one was sure of what the outcome was going to be. And then when it came down that they did owe for the diminished value on a first party basis, it was a huge verdict because think of all the people that had wrecks that didn't get paid their diminished value. And it was just this one insurance company, State Farm, of course, on the citation name. But basically, they had to come up with a way of settling millions and millions of claims for diminished value. And so what happened was that the attorneys for each side would get together and talk about how they could figure out a way to quantify the diminished value on every one of those cases. And really, the only way you can do that effectively and accurately is to have each one looked at by an appraiser. Have a
Right.
appraiser run an evaluation on every single one of them. But they weren't going to do that for sure. That would be super expensive. And so the attorneys piddled around and had some people consulting from within the insurance industry and so forth. Some of those attorneys I knew from previously that were involved in those discussions and so forth. And they came up with this formula, and it was in the 17th paragraph, section C. And so this is the formula that they agreed upon to use to settle this class action lawsuit in Georgia back in 2001. Okay, so that's the background, and we'll go into what the 17C is because multiple different carriers after that verdict came through and they read through that, they said, "Aha, we're going to use the 17C. That's how you do diminished value."
Yeah, they're
And they
jumping on
just
that bandwagon.
Right. And so that's not how you do diminished value at all. And I will go through the way that they say that they agreed to in the 17C. So they agreed to these terms, both sides. And it's not an appraisal method. It's an agreement between two parties. That's the
To
whole thing. And I'll
settle a claim, a
right.
suit.
Yeah, a class action lawsuit. So that's the main thing I wanted to get out up front is I'm intimately uh, you know, familiar, I should say, with the 17C formula. And I've seen it in many variations of it, and I analyzed it. I've testified in court about it. It's the 17C formula is, I'm going to pull one up to look at, and maybe Jen can pull this one up whenever I'm doing it. I've got one that I prepped up here. Let me find it real quick. That I'm going to use this one that I'm looking at. That's I have two of them. Okay. One of them is just like a one sheet, and the other one is like an explanation of each thing, but they're the exact same formula. And I want to show both of them, but I'm going to start with this long one. Okay. And I won't name the carrier on it, but basically we'll black out the carrier and identifiers and such on this. But first of all, they use it, they start out with the vehicle's actual cash value, okay? And they don't really define that at all. And that's one of the problems with the 17C formula, is because just saying you're going to use actual cash value doesn't define the market properly. So they explain how they're coming up with that, and it goes into saying, look, we may use state-specific guidelines, or we might include statistical market survey or NADA or any other compliant evaluation source. So they sort of blanket themselves on, we're going to, determine the actual cash value using this method, which is vague. And then the next thing is the first part of the 17C, which is 10% of that ACV is the base loss of value. That's what they call it. So as the case in most loss of value formulas, this percentage is the amount of vehicle's value that establishes the base diminution of value amount for which all additional modifiers apply. So they're just saying this is the maximum you could get, is 10% of the ACV. That's where you start at. Okay, and then they add modifiers. And so they have a damage modifier, they explain that. They have a mileage modifier, and they explain that. And then they have a couple of other modifiers that they've made up and added to this because of other cases that they've run into, I'm sure. So they're trying at least to give an explanation, but they don't do the basic, which is figure out what the market data says about diminished value. They're just using a formula that has no bearing on what the market's actually doing, and they
don't
can't
have to think
explain.
about that, like they don't have to have someone think about it.
So 17C is on the other one. I'm going to flip to the other one and talk about that real quick, because it is interesting the way that it looks like it's on an estimate from a popular estimating system. Okay, it looks like the header of a damage estimate, and so leads me to believe it's the same system that's running this, but then it just basically goes right down the same thing here: adjusted market value times base diminished value 10% times a mileage modifier times a damage modifier, and then they have a prior damage section if this vehicle had been in a prior accident, which is unusual, but they have that. But I guess if you're going to use this method, it wouldn't really matter with regard to a prior loss, because it's going to deflate the value no matter what. Only in the most ridiculously low cases would you have a 10% loss of market value. Those are the cases
that's a
that
low severity.
I mean, it can drop lower on older cars and things like that. But if you're talking about a normal new car that has, within 2 years old, and it's got some damage that's higher than a few $1,000s, if it's got 5,000 or 6,000 or more in damages to it, then it's probably going to have at the very least 10 or 11% of damage, or in that case probably 13 or 14% on one that's not just a scratch. If it's just a scratch or minor, then you're still going to have an 8 to 10% loss of market value. So this 10% base cap is the lowest you could get to begin with. And then they further go on and they add the mileage in again. So in the cash value, they're starting with a value, and they've already put the mileage in these sources to try to figure out what the value is. And then they're going to add the mileage in again, and they're going to compare it to 100,000 miles. Okay. That's what the 17C agreement was, is that cars that have under 100,000 miles, they'll agree to pay for. That doesn't mean a car that has over that doesn't have diminished value. That was just this agreement. So they're capping it at 100,000 miles, misinterpreting that as if it has more than 100,000 miles, it can't have diminished value because the formula stops at 100,000
Mhm.
miles. Well, that's just an agreement again. So then you use that, the mileage modifier. This one had about 30,000 miles on it because they're giving it a 70. So you've already used 30% of that 100,000 miles. So they gave this one a 70 on that. So 10% times 70%. So it's already dropped. So it's 70% of 10% now. And then they go into the damage modifier trying to rank the severity.
Mhm.
It's a very simplistic damage modifier, and it does not explain how they're coming up with it because it was just an agreement between attorneys. It's not based on anything. It was just them talking about it. And so
Right.
they did a pretty good job, and I think mainly because some of those attorneys already knew a little bit about it from talking to adjusters at carriers, you know. So they just do that. Then they go down, and this one they just gave it a 75% on the damage severity, and then they describe that as major damage to the structure, but it's only 75% of the diminished value, but it was major damage to the structure of the
Mhm.
vehicle. So that for me that's a high severity. Okay. When you have disclosable structural damage, it would be high severity. But again, that's because this was agreed to by two attorneys. All right. It's
Mhm.
not a way of calculating diminished value. It was a class action settlement tool. So let me see if I can go back here for a second. First of all,
Do you want to talk numbers on that one since you were talking about that case of where the first offer was when they just did the 17C on their DV assessment?
yeah. So let's see. So yeah, on this one, I'll just give the numbers
Yeah.
that were on it. This one was, let me get back to it. So this one happened in Colorado. All
Mhm.
right. So start out there, and it's the same in Texas or California or Arizona or Florida or any of these states. The same rules apply with regard to appraising vehicles and how you calculate the value of a car. So
Mhm.
this one, the customer had a a late model GMC Sierra 1500. It had 29,900 miles on it.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, this happened a couple of years back. So so I'm just using this one as an example. This is still rampant method that
Yeah.
people
Same
use,
issue.
but yeah, that insurance carriers use a lot of them anyway. But so this one started out, we did the analysis. It had nearly $20,000 worth of damages. Okay. It was like $18,000 in repair cost. And the value of it at the time, it was a 4x4 big one with bunches of it was a nice truck, okay? And we had the trade value pre-crash at 48,394. So this is the
Mhm.
trade value pre-crash, and I'll go back and explain these numbers. So and after researching the sources that we use on this, the average for a high severity structural damage history on it that has to be disclosed if it goes to auction. The average between two pretty big sources was 23%. Okay, so the diminished value was 23% of the 48,394.
Mhm.
So anyway,
To
that came out to like a
11,100. Mhm.
$11,000,
Mhm.
and that's true. It's like if you go try to trade that vehicle, there's a million of those that don't have an accident history. Okay.
Right.
And so this one takes a big hit, and it's reflected in the way dealers will make the offer for them on trade, that they
Mhm.
can't, they're going to have to sell them for less at retail too, because they can't get top dollar for it. So they won't make an offer any better than what these numbers suggest on average. And there's a low and a high. So that's the margin of error on these. So okay,
Yeah.
that one 11,000 is what we said. This
Mm-hmm.
one, she didn't have an attorney, did she? So
And their
she,
first
so she,
DV assessment came in. You
right,
already
she
said
sent her
that.
demand. No, she sent her
Oh,
demand, and now I'm going to go back to that. And we didn't
yeah.
tell the numbers. So here was the first assessment using the 17C formula. They started at a base value of 54,300. So their market value, adjusted market value, was 54,300. All right. And then their base diminished value was 10%, which was $5,430. Then their damage modifier was 70%. So it had 30,000 miles on it. So that reduced it further down to $3,801. And then they said the damage wasn't that bad, and gave it a 75, even though they did say it damaged major damage to the structure and panels. So they gave it a 75 there. That made their offer $2,850.75. That's what they wanted to offer on one that the market says loses 23% of its value at a high severity. Okay. And the market, that's the things that I want to point out. And so the first thing is the wrong market. They're using the wrong market. That comes out of the USPAP, the proper market rule is rule 7.3, and I pulled it up. This rule is standard rule 7.3, okay? And it just tells common sense here. You have to define the type and use of the vehicle, the ownership interests, and what market it's going to be sold in. So this is a privately owned vehicle, and they're not a dealer. They can't sell it at retail. They have to either sell it at private party or they have to sell it to trade. And so which of those markets for this vehicle is the largest data set for the owner selling their car? The largest data set is by far the trade-in market still. It varies a little bit depending on market, climate, so forth. But
Right. Different cars. Yeah.
for the most part, it's about 65%. If you look at um, any Mitchell Industries fans, um, there's lots of places you can look to see. It's about 65% go to trade. So that's the right market. Where would the owner most likely sell their vehicle? And it would be on the trade market. So you have to start with a trade value and you have to end with a trade value, and you have to analyze the damages and the market where it's at and how bad the damages are, and make sure you get all that right and use actual market data. So
Mm-hmm.
all that being said, they made that offer, and she she asked them how they came up with that, and they sent her a little one sheet thing that I was looking at. Okay. And we'll
Yeah.
pull that up and redact it. And so I sent her a response and I explained all this stuff that I'm talking about right now. I just said, look, that's a 17C formula. That's not how that works, blah, 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 blah. And I have a letter that I send to my customers and or attorneys when they get this response and they send it to me and say, what's this? So I send it back
Mm-hmm.
to them and I say, look, here's what that is, and here's my opinion of it. And I just lay out all the problems with it. So that's what happened. She sent that to them, and they said, you know what? We'll go ahead and hire another appraiser. Okay. Well, they didn't, or hire an appraiser. They didn't hire an appraiser the first time. They just used 17C. So
Right.
now that the victim had made a demand and had hired an appraiser, they went ahead and hired their own appraiser. Okay. This was not an appraiser. This was a computer program, but they hired another company that wasn't them to write up a diminished value assessment. And that one came in, it still was not proper at all. Uh, they missed the proper market rule on the second one as well. And
Yeah.
so on the second one, they it's a proprietary method, so you can't look up their proper market rule like you can with the USPAP that I'm quoting. You can't determine how are they doing this and where are they getting this rule. And then there's a lot of stuff missing from it, but it's a little bit better. Let's see if I can get their base numbers out of they use a proprietary that sort of hides the way that they do it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they had a pre-loss value of 51,925. So I was the lowest out of the pre-loss values because I'm using the trade-in market, the right
Right.
market. Okay. And so they're using this 51,925. They put the same repair cost in there. They drop it by $500, which is not fair because that's the deductible. That's part of the damage repair cost. So they dropped theirs down to 17.3 or something like that when it was actually 17.8 and change. Um, and then they make these bogus types of mechanical. Did they just restate what's on the damage estimate? You know, oh, it had this many labor
Right.
hours, it had this many. Okay, what does that mean? All right, how
Great.
total parts? You know, so they're making out like that, and they may be using
It's just
this
a way to
data.
add a page in, with a bunch of info.
Well, and they may be using this data, but none of that has anything to do with the market and what that vehicle will sell for at trade. It has a little bit to do with it with regard to what types of damages are disclosable, but that's really all that that has to do with it. You're not going to
Mhm.
get much better than is it structural? Is it non-structural? Is it structural and not disclosable? Is it structural and disclosable? Is it is it a scratch? What is it? You have to look at that stuff, and you have to have some reason how you're categorizing it, which we do. We use it. We use the National Auto Auction Association. So that's how you're supposed to do that. That's what drives the cost of a vehicle at trade. That's what the dealers look at to see how much can they offer on trade, and if it's got
Right.
disclosable damage, they're not going to be able to sell it at auction for any kind of, they'll break even or lose money on it, basically, if they buy it. Anyway, so all that being said, there's after they ran their proprietary formula, it doesn't explain anything about how it came up with it. It just says methodology will be included on the next page. Their diminished value was $6,004.80. So, over twice the amount that the 17C formula came up with. So that one, I think that she settled whenever they offered that amount.
Yeah, I feel like she settled for that.
Yeah, because I told her the truth, which is, although I'm right about how much the loss of market value is, if at this point they've offered you over half of what my assessment was. And so because of that, I would say it's a high risk that you can't recover much more than that in your pocket because you're going to have to file a lawsuit and hire an
Mhm.
attorney, and they're going to charge a contingency. And any attorney that works these smaller value claims, meaning like 20,000 and under for property damage, they're going to charge 40% a contingency. That's what the
Mhm.
attorneys that I use charge. And so if you can convince them to take a case like that, they're going to charge you 40%. And so the carriers know that. So she did a good job. She pushed back on the 17C. She got them to hire an outside vendor that didn't use the 17C, and it came back double what the initial offer was, and that was over 50% more than it was. It was 50%. It was over 50% of our number. I couldn't get it out.
Yeah.
So our number was 11, and
Yeah.
then
11-1.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and so she got over 50% of it. And I always tell somebody, look, if you're getting over 50% of what's on my appraisal, I think
You
yes, we could
done
win in
won.
court, but you're just going to give all that money to the attorney,
Yeah,
and
if you
so
can find an attorney,
right,
because they're
and
not
yeah, and you
jumping
may
through
not be
hoops
able
to
to.
take those cases.
Yeah, and of course, so that brings me to the next case. Okay, that's the one with the policeman, and that does have an
Yes.
attorney. Okay, to
Yes.
just sort of show. So this is one example of how a company responds to a diminished value demand, and how if you push back a little bit, you can get them to change their tune a little bit and make a different offer. So the other one, let's see, who was that? Okay, I know who he was. Let me
Mhm.
go back to that. So this one has an attorney representing him. It's funny because I work with this attorney pretty often because they just help their customers. You know what I mean? They're just trying hard to be helpful. And I don't think the attorney's even taken any money for
Yeah.
helping with the diminished value, but the paralegal is doing a really good job of staying on top of this claim. And so I wanted to go through some of the stuff that that has gone back and forth on this one because it's interesting. Let's see if I can get to that page where I was at earlier. Forgive me. Let's see. Yeah, right. Let's see.
Oh,
All right. So this is some back and forth, okay? So we do an appraisal report, and this is a live case, and so I'm not going to give any
too many
details
details.
on it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sort of recap what's going on here, and I might read some of this, and we might cut some of this stuff out and show what was actually
Yeah.
said.
Just a little. Yeah.
Okay. But long story short, we produce an appraisal for the attorney and their customer. Okay. And the paralegal makes a demand to the insurance carrier, and the insurance carrier immediately sends it off to a vendor to get a number. Okay. And it's not the same place, but it's a very similar place that uses a computer, as we talked about on the last right before this. So it's
Mm-hmm.
another one that uses a computer on it. And so it's like, okay, you know, it's like there's some problems here. So she sent me, so what happened was we had a much higher number, okay? We'll just use some percentages, okay? Their their offer was about 12% of what our assessment was. Okay. 12 to 15% of what my assessment was. And so they hired this third party company. The party company comes back and they offer less than 20% for sure of what the actual diminished value is. Something like 15%, I think, now that I'm looking at the numbers here.
Yeah.
So that came with her sending me that report and asked me. The paralegal sent it to me and said, "Hey, what do I do with this?" And so I reviewed it, okay, and I wrote a response to it, and I pointed out all the problems with it. They didn't use the proper market. They used retail market once again, which is a big problem because the retail market doesn't punish that history as bad because they have
Right.
people upselling it. Oh, it was a minor accident, ma'am, and all of that stuff, and it's just easier for them to not give you very much diminished value at retail, but it does still affect it even at retail, but that's just the wrong market.
Yeah.
Okay, so I explained that. The other thing is, look, these are not appraisals. If you go to court, you can't you have to be able to explain your methodology, and it needs to be something that you so this is a technical aspect of evidence. And it's like, for example, in Texas and across the US, there's two different main um, main ways of looking at this. They have what they call the Fry standard, which is basically a general acceptability standard. Is the method that you're using generally accepted within the industry that you work in? So the Fry standard, and then the Dalbert. I'm not saying that right because it's French and I'm Texan, but
Domain.
Dalbert, yeah, or whatever it is. But that one is, goes into a little bit more scrutiny, and it's peer reviewed and published. There's about four elements. I won't get that'll be another video. Um, but basically, they both talk about either a peer reviewed and published methodology that you can point to, or a generally accepted one, depending on the state that you're in. And this particular one is a Texas claim, and we do the DOBA. So, but that anyway, so you have to be able to explain it, and it's not an appraisal. They have a proprietary API approach. When I point this out to them, you'll see how they respond back, okay? Because it's the carrier that has hired them, and the carrier and the paralegal right now are trying to negotiate it. So there's an adjuster and a paralegal talking about it and emailing back and forth. So my response was, it's not an appraisal. That's an API. It's a proprietary, unknown methodology that they're using, and that's the problem because you can't figure it out. Then they list a bunch of comps that don't have any VINs or anything, and it's just a bunch of just listed numbers and saying it's a comp, with nothing to support it. So it's like, huh, well, all right, can't verify any of those comps, even though they're saying that they're based on actual sales records. All right. And I'm like, okay, well, let's see them. Even if it's the wrong market, I'd like to see those and see what they're selling for. Nope. Um, they have an arbitrary severity adjustment and a repair adjustment. So they do something with both of them, and they can't explain to you why they've done that. It's just arbitrary, and so there's no way to evaluate that kind of thing whenever it's just an arbitrary method, that they're using. And then,
Yeah.
also this company is pretty biased because about 90% of their business comes from insurance companies. They're a quantity DV report mill, if you will. And so they have an algorithm, and it spits out a report, and it spits it out, and then they just defend it the best that they can, which is exactly what happened next. Okay. So I sent the email recap. What I told the paralegal is that they are outside of compliance with USPAP. They're using the wrong market. Their comparables are not verifiable. Their severity adjustment is arbitrary. I mean, the right DV is the amount that I have it at based on the market data that you actually can measure and duplicate. So that was the first response. And then they respond back again. And it's like, this time, the insurance company calls the DV company and tells the DV company, y'all negotiate it with them. They're arguing about your report, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so this DV company, not even the appraiser that wrote the report or anything, it's just somebody that's, I guess, an
A
adjuster at this.
corporation. Yeah.
They said that they were an adjuster, but they're not the author of the report. They just punched the numbers into the computer. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but they didn't conduct an appraisal on it. And so this adjuster responded, and she's like, "Hey, I'm with so and so, and I work on behalf of so and so insurance. We're an unbiased third party, and they told me to handle this DV claim. And so we already sent our original report over that has such and such amount on it, and I'm happy to address Mr. Petty's concerns. Here are our responses to the points raised." So the responses were to wrong marketplace. I said, look, you're using the wrong markets. They say, we use the same marketplace as the vehicle's purchase. A true pre-loss market value is determined by providing real-world retail prices obtained from sources such as KBB. So, I mean,
Says who?
first of all, it makes no sense. We use the same marketplace as the vehicle's purchase. Okay, retail is where you purchase a vehicle if you're a private person.
But
That's
you're
not
not
where
a
you
retailer. You're
that's
right.
not where you sell a vehicle. So you never will get retail value for your car. You're not a retailer.
Right.
If you put it on the market and let it be exposed to the market for 3-4 months, exposure time on it is going to naturally depreciate, and you can sell it in the private party market potentially, or you can go trade the vehicle and buy another one. And so that's clearly, they're just telling us what they did without explaining why did they do that. I'm explaining
Mm-hmm.
exactly why we're using that. It's called the proper market rule. You have to look at the type and use of the property and the ownership interest of it. So anyway, they just say, well, we use the same marketplace where it was purchased, because that's seems smart to say, basically.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's not. The accurate DIV report is not an appraisal, is what I argued. And they just admit it. Yeah, our software is designed to assess DV in a unique way, which may differ from traditional appraisal methods. Our reports are generated using a proprietary API that accesses a comprehensive database of used car sales data.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you just admit that you're using a computer that is proprietary, not going to be is going to differ from an appraisal method, and
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to look at used car sales data. All right. Well, none of that explains how you're using that data or why you pick the vehicles that you picked. None of that. It's because that's what an appraisal standards guide does, is it sets forth the way that you have to develop that data. In this situation, there's nobody governing that. There's nobody. They're not using the standards for appraisals. They've just made up their own way of doing it. And
Mhm.
it comes in, of course, low when you compare it to the actual market data. So that was their response to it's not an appraisal. Yeah, we know, yeah, we know it's not an appraisal. And the report, I said, look, you can't verify the comparables either. And so their response to that was, well, that's, we're using real sales data. However, due to personally identifiable information, PII, this data can't be legally shared on our report.
That's
Okay.
convenient.
So, I have something to say about that, and I did respond after this. So, unverifiable comparables. Yeah, it's got private info in there. So sorry about that. So they don't deny that either, that there's nothing there to look at because they won't give it to you. The report contains arbitrary severity adjustment and repair adjustment. I point that out too. So she's trying to respond to that. And her response is this amount reflects the severity of damages caused to your vehicle by the accident. The diminished value solely related to this loss is the difference between the pre and post loss value minus normal depreciation. Well, I don't know if she's getting there, which she puts in
Repair
parentheses
adjustment.
repair adjustment. So this is some made up method that they're using
She's
internally
just
to come
making it
up
up as she
with.
goes.
Maybe so. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's like, yeah, that's my point. It's arbitrary. How are you coming up with the severity rating?
Right.
You don't define severity rating as severity rating. Yeah, the repair and severity rating reflects the severity rating and repair rating. That's their definition. It's just they're just doing
A circle back. Yeah.
it's like a comedy act,
My TV's trying to come on for some reason.
So those are the things that we talked about, and their bias, as well. I'm like, they do work for insurance companies all the time. This is
Tons of
built that
work.
way. It's meant
Yeah.
to sell to insurance companies because you can sell a lot more of them at a cheaper price and still make money, and it's fast and easy. And so that's what they do.
Yeah.
So
Push of a
anyway,
button.
so hey, kudos to them for responding back as well.
Yeah.
So they
I mean,
responded
because
back
usually
and
the way they respond is just a form letter of some sort. They don't try to dive in and be the expert.
right. And so, and it was from this company too.
Yeah.
So, it's somebody that works at this, anyway, then so they sent it back to me. I did a big response, and basically my response was, look, they have not addressed any of these issues. And I go back into detail about why what they're arguing is not an argument, just like I just sort of did. Okay. But I put it in some more formal language there, the wrong marketplace. I go in and I say, look, you know, it has to be, I address this the same marketplace as its vehicle purchase and cite the KBV and blah, blah, blah for a true loss value. I just address that, look, that's, that's not the right market. That confirms that you're using the retail market and not the dealer trade-in market, which the appraisal standards require that you use the appropriate market for the type of vehicle, the ownership interest, and the intended use of the vehicle. It's a private vehicle used for private purposes, owned by a private individual, and it would be sold in the trade-in market. So they don't explain any of that like I do in my appraisal, and like I can if you ask me. And so they just say, yeah, we're using retail. No reason why. Okay.
Right.
Oh, because that's where they purchased it. Yeah, that's the point. Is that that's where you buy a car. That's not where you sell a car.
Right.
So it's so frustrating. It's then they just admit it's they try to respond back on the API thing and it's proprietary, and they just openly acknowledge that it differs from appraisal methods and it's not an appraisal. And so it can't be used in court as evidence. You have to have somebody there to cross-examine if you're presenting evidence. You
Yeah.
can't cross-examine a proprietary API. Who do you cross-examine in that? Get the developer and the consultant that worked on it out here. We want to depose them on how they came up with with the process.
It reminds me of that one time that one expert wanted the court to pay for a report if they wanted to see his methodology in
It
the
gets me fired
report
up. I'm telling you, it gets me
in
fired
the
up
class
thinking
that he
about it.
taught and got paid
Yeah,
for.
boy. But what did
Oh,
you rely on? What did you rely on? Well, if you want that, you'll have to buy a copy of it
you cannot make that up. You cannot.
in a deposition.
In a deposition, yeah.
It gets me fired up. I have to slow down a second, but then the comparables. I addressed their look. You can't say private party info, private, identifying information. When you're doing a evaluation, the comparable data has to
You
be
can't just say
sufficient. This comes
trust
out of the
us.
USPAP. It comes out of the
Yeah.
appraisal standards. You have to have sufficiently disclosed the data to allow the conclusion to be understood and tested. You can't just
Mm-hmm.
say, look, here's the comps that we used, and then not explain anything about that. They just basically used a bunch of list of vehicles to come up with a value in the wrong market, and it was too low of a value in my opinion. They were at a lower number for retail even, so they're bringing the retail down a little bit, which is to their advantage because this is going to be a lesser amount of diminished value too.
Right.
So I addressed that. Look, that's a BS argument. You have to disclose that stuff. You could leave the VINs and identifying details of the vehicle, but you could redact all of the other stuff while providing or you could even delete the VINs if you wanted to, but give us where the vehicle was sold, the date, the odometer readings, and the condition of the vehicle. We want to see if you're using comps, did you look at all that stuff and are they really comps? So even if you're going to use that, no. Anyway, they're not going to give that. Then the repair and severity adjustment, I addressed the arbitrary lump sum deduction with no formula published, no explanation of anything, no correlation to recognize any damage severity guidelines, no reconciliation to market data, all of these issues with the way that they're coming up with their number. And so after my sort of response back, the they came back again. So I sent this to the paralegal explaining again why all these responses don't address any of the issues. It's still the same arguments because you haven't addressed any of them. Why are you using that? Let's discuss it. And I said, let's get on a conference call with the expert. There is no expert on the other side. So that's the problem. So sent it back. She sent it back. They come back with a one-liner after that. They made an increased offer of, they added a little bit to their offer, not very much, but some. When we pointed out that they haven't addressed any of these issues, why would they accept less than 20% of the amount of diminished value? Why would they accept that? They have nothing to consider except what y'all sent, which Mr. Petty has basically torn apart here. It has nothing to do with how much the value has decreased. It's just an arbitrary method of coming up with a settlement number. Their response was, we stand firm behind our number. We stand firm behind it. And so it continues ongoing. So at this point, the paralegal is calling out the improper negotiation of this claim by a non-contracted third-party appraisal company. So this insurance company just called this appraisal company, and the appraisal company just stepped in and started negotiating the claim on it.
Mm-hmm.
Either that they are biased because they either have a contract with this carrier to third party administer claims, and they're writing diminished value estimates and running their diminished value program on it, or they're an independent and they're not allowed to negotiate for an insurance company or an individual or anything like that. They're not attorneys. You can't settle a claim if you're not an employee of the insurance company or contracted as a third party administrator for them. And so
Mm-hmm.
she's calling them out on that issue. She tried as a courtesy to get this claim resolved with the third party because she had me helping her explain why these issues are there, why it's not a credible assessment, so forth. So that one's ongoing and it'll settle, trust me. It'll end up settling because it's got an attorney on it, and this attorney will either litigate it himself or save that part out for a sister firm, if you will, to litigate it. And so
Mm-hmm.
it will get litigated. If they don't get up to over 50%, of the amount, then it might not be worth it to continue fighting. But they're nowhere close to that right now. They're still, way far away. What else was there, Jen? I think
I feel like you've
I
talked about
wanted,
all the cases that we were going to talk
yeah,
about.
I mean, I've gone on and droned on a little bit here, but
Yeah,
it's good
we're on
info
a
about
long
it.
video right now.
Yeah, so I would say let's, you know, come up with some clever closing of some kind. You do
On the
that
fly.
part.
I know, I'm
Yes, you
so
come
good
up
at the
with
witty
some
stuff. I
clever
know.
closing, and we'll end it because I think I've touched everything. We
Yeah, I
might
feel
go
like
into
you've
more
gone
detail later.
over a plethora of information regarding the 17C. Take your notes, folks. Get your notepads out, all the things. Do your chat GPT stuff. Yeah, so if you have any questions or if you have dealt with the 17C formula, leave a comment on our video. Like us, share us, and thank you so much for your support. And we'll be back again next week
In
with
the video,
another episode.
I hadn't got to do
Bye.
that in a while.
Bye.